The sky was dark, the air thick with the smell of smoke and blood. The village, once a peaceful hamlet, now lay in ruins. Houses burned, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the night. This was not the first time such a scene had played out in this part of the world. For centuries, the land between the Elbe and Oder rivers had been a battleground, a place where German and Slavic cultures clashed and intertwined in a complex and often violent dance. In the early Middle Ages, this region was a melting pot of peoples. The Slavs, who had inhabited the land for generations, saw their way of life threatened by the advancing Germans. The Germans, driven by a mix of religious zeal and the desire for new land, pushed eastward, claiming territories that had long been Slavic. This was the era of the so-called German East colonization, a period that would shape the history of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. But the story of this land is not just one of conflict. It is also a story of coexistence and mutual influence. The Slavs and Germans did not just fight. They also traded, intermarried, and built communities together. The traces of this shared history can still be found in the toponyms, the architecture, and the cultural practices of the region. One of the most significant figures in this story is Hermann Oben, a historian who, in the early 20th century, sought to use the past to justify German claims to Eastern Europe. Oben and his colleagues, known as the Ostforscher, argued that the Germans had a historical right to the land because they had brought civilization and progress to the Slavic territories. This view was part of a broader political strategy to contain Poland and other Slavic nations after World War I. The idea of Germania Slavica, a term coined by later historians, represents a more balanced and nuanced understanding of this period. It acknowledges the complex interactions between Germans and Slavs, the ways in which both groups contributed to the development of the region, and the cultural and economic ties that bound them together. In the 1950s and 1960s, a new generation of historians began to challenge the old narratives. In West Germany, scholars like Walter Schlesinger started to see the German East colonization as part of a broader European process of internal colonization. In East Germany, historians like Ingrid Hagemann took a Marxist approach, emphasizing the role of feudal lords and the negative impact of German expansion on Slavic development. The discovery of extensive archaeological evidence in the post-World War II period played a crucial role in this shift. The ruins of Slavic settlements and the artifacts found there revealed a rich and developed Slavic culture that predated the arrival of the German. This evidence showed that the Slavs were not just passive victims, but active participants in the region's history. The concept of Germania Slavica was further developed by scholars like Wolfgang H. Fritzi, who saw it as the mutual interaction between Slavic and German ethnic characters during the medieval German East colonization. For Fritzi, this interaction was a key part of the development of new German tribes in the East, with a strong Slavic component. Klaus Zernak, a historian from Berlin, took this idea even further. He saw Germania Slavica as just the first stage of a broader process of acculturation that spread from the west to the east of Europe. According to Zernak, this process led to the westernization of Eastern Europe and the development of other mixed settlement areas like Polonia Polonica and Russia Ruthenica. Herbert Ludat, another prominent historian, focused on the Slavic prehistory of the colonization period. He saw the Elbe region as a crucial point of European history, where Slavic and German cultures merged and created a new, integrated society. Ludat's work emphasized the importance of interdisciplinary approaches, combining history, archaeology, and linguistics to understand the complex interactions between the different peoples. The concept of Germania Slavica has even been applied to other regions. Danish historians, for example, talk about Dania Slavica to describe the Slavic presence on the Danish islands and the trade between Danes and Slavs from the Elbe region and the Baltic Sea. This new perspective has helped to replace old prejudices with a more factual and objective understanding of history. In the early Middle Ages, the Elbe region was not a coherent Slavic territory, but a patchwork of different Slavic groups, each with its own culture and language. Some of these groups, like the Wilzes and the Abatrites, were even hostile to each other. The Slavs moved into German-speaking areas, where they were often employed on Frankish domains without necessarily giving up their way of life, or immediately converting to Christianity. The borders in this region were not clearly defined. The Germans used the rivers Elbe and Saal as natural boundaries, but the area was characterized by linguistically and ethnically mixed populations. Small Slavic kinship groups continued to settle in the region well into the 10th century, often living in close proximity to their German neighbors. The story of Germania Slavica is a story of conflict, coexistence, and transformation. It is a story that continues to unfold, as new research and discoveries shed light on the complex and fascinating history of this region. As we explore the past, we gain a deeper understanding of the roots of modern Europe, and the ways in which different cultures have shaped and been shaped by each other. In the Middle Ages, the Germanic peoples and the Slavic tribes had a complex and often confrontational relationship. This interaction began to take significant shape during the time of Charlemagne, even though his primary focus was not on expanding eastward. However, his efforts laid the groundwork for future interventions. Charlemagne's control over the areas east of the Elbe and Saal rivers allowed him to manage the Slavic tribes and the rulers he acknowledged. He was particularly concerned about the interactions between the Saxons, Danes, Obotrites, and Wilses, as these groups posed potential threats. After the shift of power to Bavaria in the late 9th century, the Franks lost interest in the Slavic tribes of the Elbe and Baltic regions, and instead focused on the rising Moravian power in the southeast. It was the Liudolfing dynasty, the ancestors of the Attinian dynasty, who brought the Elbe-Saal-Oder region back into imperial politics. Duke Henry I, later King Henry I, was especially interested in the territories east of the Saal. This region became crucial because the Hungarians used it as a base for their raids against the Saxons. Henry's military campaigns were successful, including victories against Slavic tribes from 928 and a major battle against the Hungarians in 933. Despite these successes, Henry did not aim to extend his rule far beyond the Elbe-Saal line. Instead, he focused on collecting tributes from the eastern regions. His son, Otto I, had a different vision. Otto sought both the political subjugation and the Christianization of the Slavs east of the Elbe. In 948, he established the dioceses of Brandenburg and Havelberg, and later, the Archdiocese of Magdeburg and other dioceses like Merseburg in 968. He also set up the Diocese of Oldenburg in Wagria, which was under the Archdiocese of Hamburg-Bremen. To support these ecclesiastical efforts, Otto granted land east of the Saal to loyal followers, and appointed margraves to govern these areas. These margraves were responsible for both the political and military control of the region, mirroring the ecclesiastical divisions. This strategy aimed to shift the eastern border of the Frankish Empire from the Elbe and Saal rivers to the Oder River. However, this process was interrupted by the Slavic uprising of 983, which pushed the imperial border back to the Elbe for over a century. The Slavic tribes, particularly the Liutises, had a unique culture characterized by a revival of pre-Christian beliefs and a decentralized political structure. Despite the pressure from their Christian neighbors, the Liutises showed remarkable resilience. It wasn't until the mid-12th century that the last heathen areas in Central Europe, including Brandenburg, fell to the Christian rulers. Margrave Albert the Bear took control of Brandenburg Castle, marking a significant step in the conquest of the Elbe area. The expansion into the Slavic territories of the Elbe and Baltic regions was driven by economic and social changes in Europe. As cities grew, they developed a complementary relationship with the countryside, leading to a more monetized economy. Cultivating and trading crops became increasingly profitable, which led to the expansion of arable land. Colonists from the west, including Flemish and Dutch peasants, were hired to settle in new areas, founding villages and cities with new statutes. By the end of this process, the region had been transformed, as described by the chronicler Helmold of Bassau. All the country of the Slavs extending towards the Baltic Sea and the Elbe River was now, through the grace of God, made, as it were, one colony of the Saxons. This transformation was not solely German. The Danes in the north and the Poles in the east also competed for the rich lands. The process involved the hiring of about 200,000 people from the west, who settled in around 50,000 holdings and farms, creating new villages from Schwerin to Spandau and Dresden. These colonists were given a privileged status under the German law. which was a legal framework that reorganized society. Slavic settlers sometimes adopted this law due to a lack of Western immigrants, and over time, different legal systems coexisted until homogeneity was achieved. The process of Germanization was regionally varied and took generations to complete. While some areas, like the Baltic island of Rügen, remained under Danish control and saw little German settlement, others, like the Hanoverian Wendland, retained Slavic language until the 18th century. The Sorbs of the Loss, its area, still speak their Slavic dialect today. Despite these differences, the region known as Germania Slavica took shape over many centuries and played a significant role in German history. In the early 1900s, historians in the United States faced a unique challenge when studying medieval Europe. They were not only geographically distant from the European archives, but also culturally and historically removed from the medieval world. One of the most notable figures in this field was Henry Charles Lea, who dedicated his life to studying the Inquisition and heresy in medieval Europe. Despite never holding an academic position, Lea became a leading expert and even served as the president of the American Historical Association in 1903. Lee's work was groundbreaking, especially his multi-volume History of the Inquisition of the Middle Ages, which he published in 1887. He also wrote extensively on other forms of medieval superstition and punishment. What made Lea unique was his approach to history. He believed in using a scientific method, which meant careful research and avoiding sensationalism. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Lea did not want to write a one-sided pro-Protestant or anti-Catholic history. Instead, he aimed to be impartial and understand the Inquisition in its historical context. One of the biggest challenges Lea faced was accessing the European archives. In those days, it was common for historians to travel to Europe to study original documents. However, Lea, being in the United States, had to find a different way. He relied on correspondents in Europe who would send him copies of manuscripts. This method was so well known that even Lord Acton, a famous English historian, wrote about it in a review of Lee's work. Acton joked that some manuscripts never returned to England, which Lea had to defend himself against. Despite these challenges, Lee's work was highly respected. He believed that to understand the past, historians had to live in it for a time. This meant putting aside modern moral judgments and trying to see the world as people did in the Middle Ages. Lea argued that moral standards change over time, and that what was considered right or wrong in the past might not be the same today. He encouraged historians to be empathetic and to understand the intentions and beliefs of the people they studied. Lee's approach was different from that of Lord Acton, a prominent English historian. Acton believed that historians should judge the past by the moral standards of the present. Lea, however, thought this was unfair and anachronistic. He believed that historians should try to understand the past on its own terms, even if it meant seeing things that seem cruel or wrong by today's standards. Lee's work on the Inquisition and heresy influenced a generation of medieval historians in the United States. His emphasis on context, empathy, and scientific research set a new standard for the field. Even though the study of medieval Europe was challenging for American historians, Lea showed that it was possible to bridge the gap between the past and the present through careful and thoughtful scholarship. In the 1960s and 1970s, a new generation of American medievalists, influenced by postmodernism and social change, began to see the Middle Ages in a different light. They focused on the grotesque and strange aspects of medieval life, such as religious persecution, heresy, and Inquisition. This new perspective was a reaction against the earlier view of the Middle Ages as a rational and familiar period. Instead, these historians highlighted the differences and the otherness of medieval society, emphasizing its brutality and irrationality. However, this new approach was not entirely new. Lea had already explored the darker aspects of medieval life, but he did so with a sense of historical empathy and a commitment to understanding the past on its own terms. This shows that the idea of the Middle Ages as other has a long and complex history in American medieval studies. It also highlights the enduring challenge of balancing historical distance with the need to understand the past in its own context. Henry Charles Lea, a historian from the late 19th century, had a complex and nuanced view of the medieval Inquisition. To To modern eyes, the Inquisition might seem cruel and irrational, but Lea argued that it made sense within the context of medieval Christian beliefs and social norms. For example, Lea believed that the Inquisition was a reasonable and pious response to heresy because medieval people saw heresy as a grave threat to both the community and the salvation of souls. Lea's perspective on the Inquisition was not entirely positive. He understood that the Inquisition was often used for selfish and greedy purposes, but he also recognized that the people who supported it genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. This understanding of context did not mean Lea condoned the Inquisition's actions. Rather, he believed that understanding the past on its own terms could help prevent similar injustices in the present. Lea's work was influenced by his own experiences and the world around him. He lived in a time when religious and ethnic tensions were high, and he saw how intolerance could lead to violence. For example, in 1844, Lea guarded a Catholic church in Philadelphia during riots against Irish Catholics. He also witnessed the American Civil War, which showed how religious beliefs could be used to justify extreme actions, such as slavery and war. Lea believed that the lessons of the past were relevant to the present. He argued that religious persecution was not unique to medieval Europe, but was a recurring theme in human history. Even in 19th century America, religious minorities faced violence and discrimination. Lea saw this as a continuation of the same intolerant mindset that had fueled the Inquisition. In his address to the American Historical Association, Lea highlighted the importance of understanding the past without judging it by modern standards. He believed that this approach could help historians contribute to progress and make the world a better place. By studying the Inquisition and other instances of religious persecution, Lea hoped to raise awareness and promote tolerance in his own time. Lea's influence on American scholarship was significant. His work on the Inquisition was highly regarded, and he inspired future historians like Charles Homer Haskins and Joseph Strayer. These scholars continued Lea's tradition of contextualizing the past and recognizing the enduring relevance of historical lessons. One of Lea's key insights was that the past and the present are interconnected. He saw that the same forces that led to the Inquisition, such as the misuse of religious authority and the persecution of minorities, were still present in his own time. By drawing these connections, Lea hoped to encourage his readers to be more critical of their own society and to strive for a more just and inclusive world. In 1950, a dramatic event in Paris illustrated the ongoing relevance of Lea's work. On Easter Sunday, a group of young men, including Michel Mourre, disrupted a mass at Notre Dame Cathedral. Mourre, dressed as a Dominican monk, jumped onto the altar and declared that God was dead. The incident shocked the congregation and led to a discussion about the role of religion in modern society. Mourre's actions, though extreme, reflected a growing dissatisfaction with traditional religious institutions and a desire for a new, more inclusive spirituality. This event, like Lea's historical work, highlighted the enduring tension between religious tradition and modern values. It showed that the questions Lea explored about the nature of religious belief, the limits of tolerance, and the dangers of persecution were still relevant in the 20th century and beyond. By studying the past, Lea and his successors hoped to create a better future, one where the lessons of history could be applied to build a more just and compassionate world. As we come to the end of our journey through the complex and sometimes strange relationship between the Middle Ages and modern America, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the stories we've uncovered. We've seen how different people, scholars, rebels, and even a passionate young Catholic have looked to the medieval past to understand and challenge their own times. Henry Charles Lea, Michel Mourre, and the Situationists all used the Middle Ages, especially its themes of heresy and Inquisition, to express their disappointment with the present. For Lea, the Inquisition was a rational but evil part of history that still haunted the modern world. For Mourre, the passionate zeal of the medieval church was what made it truly religious, and he longed for a return to that intensity. The Situationists, on the other hand, saw medieval heretics as kindred spirits in their fight against the soulless consumer culture of the 20th century. These views of the medieval past were not just about the past. They were also deeply rooted in the present. Mourre and the Situationists didn't see the past as a distant, unreachable other. Instead, they believed that the past and present were intertwined, and that the medieval could be brought to life in the modern world. This blurring of time is very different from the idea of alterity, seeing the past as fundamentally different from the present, that became popular among American medievalists. For scholars like Caroline Walker Bynum, the Middle Ages were a place of strangeness and alterity, a time and culture that defied modern expectations. This view helped medievalists avoid the trap of presentism, interpreting the past through the lens of the present, and recognize the unique aspects of medieval life. But this focus on strangeness also had its limits. By emphasizing the otherness of the medieval past, scholars sometimes lost sight of the ways in which the past and present are connected. When we think about the role of religion in all of this, the picture becomes even more complex. For Lea, Mourre, and the Situationists, religion was a powerful force that could drive people to do both good and evil. Modern American scholars, on the other hand, often see medieval religion as a kind of grotesque, an irrational, violent, and alien form of belief. This view of medieval religion as strange and distant helps to reinforce the idea of a modern, secular West that has moved beyond the supposed irrationality of the past. But is this really the case? Modern America still has its own forms of religious intensity, from charismatic Christian worship to practices like body modification and polygamy. These practices, while different from medieval ones, share some of the same elements of bodiliness, emotion, and ritual. By focusing on the strangeness of medieval religion, scholars might be overlooking the ways in which similar elements persist in modern religious life. In the end, the relationship between the Middle Ages and modern America is a mirror that reflects our own values and assumptions. The Middle Ages can be a source of inspiration, a warning, or a way to challenge the present. But it can also be a way to understand our own time better, to see the connections between past and present, and to recognize that the past is never really lost, but always present in some form. As we close this book, we might take a lesson from the young Michel Mourre, walking the roads of Languedoc and imagining St. Dominic around the next bend. The past is not just a distant memory. It is a living presence that can guide and challenge us. And in the end, the strangeness of the Middle Ages is not just a way to make the past seem distant and different. It is also a way to see the present in a new light, to recognize the enduring power of the past, and to embrace the complexity and richness of human history.